All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Hello and welcome to Empowering Your Organization Data Ethics Edition. We're so excited to present here at Good Tech Fest on behalf of LA Tech for Good. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, LA Tech for Good works at the intersection of social impact and technology. We foster social change by teaching equitable and ethical data practices so that we can empower individuals to use data more responsibly, ultimately building a more equitable world. We're also rebranding. So while we start in LA, we have members all across the country, and we look forward to connecting with folks all around the world on these important topics. My name is Cindy Lynn, pronouns she, they. I'm a member of the LA Tech for Good speaker team. I first became involved with LA Tech for Good after attending the Leading Equitable Data Practices workshop in December 2020. I took what I learned there in that workshop and implemented it at HopSkip Drive, where I was the senior data product manager. At the beginning of this year, I left that job and I started my own data consultancy, and I offer services in data culture, data product management, as well as operating as a fractional data leader, all of which I have integrated data equity and AI practices or AI ethics practices into.
And hi, I'm Eva Satcher. I also took LA Tech for Good's Leading Equitable Data Workshop or Data Practices Workshop 2 years ago, and I've been volunteering with the organization ever since. So now I facilitate these workshops, and I also sit on our board as a partnership strategy lead. Outside of LA Tech for Good, I worked as a data scientist in healthcare and in the public sector. So I've worked to get leadership support for data ethics work, and also to build these best practices into team culture and the data science workflow. So Cindy and I are going to take the next 40 minutes to recap data equity and AI ethics. We'll share some relevant resources and hopefully leave you with a sense of direction and empowerment on how to get started with this work at your organizations. So we're really excited to be here with you today and share some of what we've learned with you. All right, so before we get into our main question, which is how do I do data ethics, we just want to back it up a little bit and define some of the terms that we'll be using throughout our session today, just so you can visualize how they build upon one another. So at this base layer, we have our underlying context, and that's society. So we have our social inequities such as sexism, racism, classism, and ableism, and all of these isms are embedded in our technology in multiple ways. So our social context influences how we think, our own unconscious biases, and our awareness of certain communities and perspectives. So this feeds into design justice, which is based on a book by Sasha Costanza-Chalk. And the author offers this framework to guide us in thinking about what problems we use AI to solve, how they're funded, who they're built to advantage, also in thinking through if they'll harm minority communities and people who aren't often invited to the room when technology is being built, and then also how we identify and reevaluate these power dynamics so that technology is being built to serve everyone. Moving up the pyramid, now we can think about data equity. So as part of this, we consider where are we sourcing our data, how are we collecting our data, who's represented, and what metrics are we measuring. And then at the top of this pyramid, we have AI ethics. So when we talk about AI ethics, we have a lot of the same concerns that we do when we think about design justice and data equity, but it's at a higher magnitude just given the nature of how AI is built and understood and used. So with AI, we're usually working with larger data sets. The solutions are usually more technical and complex, and we're working with black box models that can be a little bit more challenging to interpret and understand. Okay, so something that we like to say here at LA Tech for Good is that equity is both an outcome and a process. And this is a quote from Data Feminism. So as an outcome, equity means that we're addressing disparities and we're trying to be fair in treatment and opportunity and access. But equity isn't just an end goal. It's also a way to frame data from start to finish. So to get there, we need to be identifying underlying causes of inequities and bias and thinking from the lens of equity, from the lens of justice and inclusivity to actually get to these equitable outcomes. So in order to for individuals to be treated fairly and according to their needs, folks who work with data need to carefully consider context and thoughtfully approach the collection, use, and analysis of both individual and collective data.
Thank you so much, Eva, for giving that rundown of those concepts. So If you didn't already join the session thinking, I want to get started with the data equity and AI ethics, I hope you've convinced you of the importance of this work. But knowing that you have to do something is very different than doing something. For me, I really struggled with where to start after I learned about these concepts in that workshop. And so I thought, why don't we break this down a little bit? To begin, we just want to say there are multiple ways of starting your data equity and AI ethics journey. What you're seeing on the screen are just some of the projects, initiatives, and ideas that we have in this area, and I'm sure there are more. If there are projects that you're thinking about that you're not seeing here, definitely share those in the chat. Some of the ones that we've thought of are just starting with, doing some training for your internal team, just making sure they're aware of some of these topics. We'll talk more about that in a second. Introducing specific tools into your existing processes, looking at the data that you're already collecting and whether or not you need to disaggregate it so that you can see different unique communities that are not being represented when you're looking at the higher level picture. Diversifying your data team. We know that diversity improves all outcomes, and that's true of the data team as well. Looking at who has access to what data, making sure that data is secure and private for those across the board. Maybe looking at data collection options. For a long time, gender was binary, and so we only collected 2 genders. If your organization's still doing that, maybe look at what's being collected, and that's just one example of how data collection. You can look at data collection options to make sure that they're inclusive. Getting kind of into the more technical things, you can look at algorithms and see if they're being biased. And ultimately, and the last thing on here, not the last thing ever, is analyzing collected data for bias and inequity. So these are just some of the ideas that we think are important, but definitely share if you have more. So now that you have an idea of some of the projects that you can work on, we wanted to talk about what you specifically can do to make this work move along in your organization. So for the rest of the session, we're going to be talking about these items. We're going to talk through how you ask tough questions, help you make the case for data equity and AI ethics, help you get stakeholder buy-in, make sure your leadership is aligned with this work, talk through the specifics of implementation and measurement, and ultimately help you sustain through the governance structure that you have.
Awesome. All right, so like Cindy said, asking tough questions is the first step that we can take. This is pretty straightforward, and it's a great way to apply the data ethics lens to your work. So these questions will change based on your role and your projects and the nature of your organization, but here are just some examples of questions that you can ask at different parts of the data lifecycle. So I'll just highlight a couple from the slide here. So we know that AI solutions are generally a bit complex. So a question that we can ask is right in the beginning is thinking through if using AI is necessary or if we're pursuing a predictive model just because it's fancier and it's more exciting to work on. So something that you can ask right as you're considering a project to start is, do we need to use AI to solve this problem, or is a simpler data solution sufficient? I'm also sure that you've all seen several cases in the media where biased models are built and deployed, and they had serious ramifications that could easily have been avoided if more diverse people were in the room and aware of the work that was being done. So we don't want to make assumptions about what solutions are helpful. Instead, it's usually better to involve communities and end users in the solutions that we're building. So to that end, advocate for diversity and get more perspectives early on. So a great question to ask here is, do we have a diverse group of stakeholders involved throughout the project to ensure that data is being used in a responsible way? And the last question that I'll bring attention to on this slide is the last one. So usually when we're building a dashboard, it's to answer a certain question, or we're trying to visualize a trend and support a specific decision that's meant to be made. So there are a lot of small decisions and design changes that we can make as data analysts, such as labels, scales, and colors that change how we interpret these visualizations and use them to support decision making. So even being aware of the influence that we have is helpful in thinking through if we're visualizing our data in a way that might encourage misleading conclusions. So it's great to be asking tough questions throughout the data lifecycle to bring more awareness and purposeful decision-making to your teams. So like we said in our introduction, today we want you to walk away feeling empowered and knowing where to start. So to support that, we'll be walking through an example of biased AI from the media and guiding our discussion based on this, so you can see how to apply some of the resources and suggestions that we're bringing in. So to start off with this example of predictive policing, this is based on an article published in The Verge by Matt Stroud. So in 2013, the Chicago Police Department built a model in which they predicted an individual's likelihood to be involved in a shooting, and they call this the heat list. So this model determined that this 23-year-old man on the slide, Robert McDaniel, was at risk of being involved in a shooting based on his proximity to and his relationships with known shooters and shooting casualties. So he could be the shooter, or he might be the one who would get shot. They didn't know. They just knew that he showed up on the heat list. So as soon as he becomes placed on this list, he becomes a target of constant surveillance by the Chicago Police Department, who treated him as both a potential victim and a potential perpetrator. So a social worker would show up to his house and offer help securing a job and mental health services. And at the same time, the police were surveilling him by showing up to his place of work. They would follow him, and they were also asking his managers about his activities and where he was. So the police distrusted him because his name was on this heat list, and then eventually his friends and neighbors began to distrust him because they assumed he was cooperating with law enforcement. So tensions build, rumors spread, and then one day someone drives by and shoots Robert because they thought that he was an informant. So to summarize, the police wanted to reduce shootings, so they built a predictive model that identifies where shootings will occur, but then their intervention and their constant presence actually led to McDaniel getting shot. So the police had good intentions here, but then they leveraged data in a way that put this young man's life at risk. And so there's a lot of irony here, and you could almost say that they spoke this outcome into existence. So throughout the session today, we'll be kind of reflecting back on this example and thinking about it from a data ethics lens to kind of reiterate on at what points could things have been done differently. Okay, so bringing this back to asking tough questions, here are some examples of maybe what we could have asked if we were a data scientist or the Chicago Police Department, or just someone who was in the room while this model was being built. So firstly, did they even ask the right question? The model maybe should have focused on who's likely to be a shooter, or instead who's likely to be a victim, so that the intervention could have focused on kind of like either end of this. We've also discussed this in previous workshops, and participants often come to the conclusion that this model shouldn't have been built altogether, and it's just an example of funds being misallocated, and perhaps like a Department of Human Services should have been more involved in building a predictive model that could, help resource allocation or something like that. Another question that I just wanted to highlight is thinking about where the data is sourced from and how that might be biased. So it's pretty well documented that police will stop and arrest Black men at much higher rates than other groups. So if we're training this heat list on historical police records, then we see this historical bias being introduced in the training set, which is probably going to lead to biased predictions. So again, just even pausing to think through this could have led to some type of sampling of the data or some other steps to kind of mitigate inaccurate outcomes. Okay, so we're moving on to the next step that you can take, but we'll circle back to this example from The Verge as we continue to share resources. So our next step is making the case. So this is laying the groundwork to gather support for this work. So the kind of first step you can take is maybe try to start a book club or a working group at your organization where you share articles like the one we just went over or other exposés of biased AI, and you can just discuss those with coworkers. And I also wanted to emphasize here the benefit of talking to folks outside your role or team. Previously, when I've led a working group, people in other parts of the organization were often like really, really valuable contributors, such as lawyers or people in customer-facing roles, or even people who are coming from other industries. They have a lot of dimensionality to bring to these conversations. And overall, there's just a lot that we can learn from other disciplines. So find allies in other teams. Our second point here is similar to asking tough questions, but also take the time to do some reading and learning and suggest better practices and alternatives to the status quo. And then lastly is this really valuable step is to kind of map your mission and your values to the basic principles behind data equity and AI ethics. And at this point, you've already made half the case for why you should take on this work. It'll allow you to explain how data equity will help you further your mission, further your impact, and also lead to better outcomes for your organization and for the people that you serve. All right, so let's zoom into one of these so we can walk through a resource that we share in our workshops. So we're going to focus on we're going to focus on the data that we're using and how this data source could potentially serve us. All right, so quick detour is we all see nutrition labels on our food, and that actually took a lot of grassroots effort to gain attention, starting with groups that advocated for folks with allergies, and this eventually got enough attention and the government got involved, and now nutrition labels are regulated and we see them on all of our food. So the Data Nutrition Project took inspiration from this and created a template to evaluate data sources, to inform users about use cases and limitations. So going through an exercise where you fill out a data nutrition label for a data set is a great way to facilitate conversations that prioritize transparency and accountability as you choose what data to work with and move forward with. So as you can see here, there's a description, there are some alert counts, recommended use cases, and then there's a list of badges that inform you of what the data has and hasn't been evaluated for. So thinking back to the heat list model, we're evaluating a data set of historical police records. So as you see here under the alert count, there's one for socioeconomic bias. So that's something that would have probably been flagged in this data set because we know there's an issue in the representation of Black men in police records. So this could have informed data scientists to take some steps in resampling their data set. Also in the process of filling out the use cases and the badges, there could have been a longer discussion about whether or not police records are a trustworthy resource for the heat list model, and we could have been a little bit more careful about how we proceeded. So I'll hand it over to Cindy to go over our next step.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so the next step is getting stakeholder buy-in, because the biggest impact you can have is when everyone is engaged in this work, so it's important to get everyone on board. So we want to talk about some of the key groups that we think are important in order to make sure that they're bought in and you can move this work along. So the first one here is executive leadership. Of course, they're at the top. They can halt resources from being allocated to projects, or they can fast track them. They set the tone for what's important at the company. So if you convince them that this is important, then you make your lives much easier for yourself. It's really important to touch upon the ROI of this work for them and how it aligns with those existing organizational values, like Eva just said. And we'll talk more specifics about tactics to get them invested on the next slide. Next is our legal and regulatory groups. The compliance folks at your team are concerned with risk, and the risks of really not adopting data equity and AI ethics are just growing. If unchecked, data can be used to perpetuate discrimination and harm, as we saw with the Chicago PD's predictive policing algorithm. So make sure your regulatory and legal risk teams understand how the work of data equity and AI ethics mitigates that risk. Finally, and probably the most important, are the workers and our contributors. These are the individuals that are working day to day with data, generating, collecting, analyzing, and in some cases, building these models. So it's important that they understand the impact that they have when they're using this information. And they understand how things like equity and ethics are intrinsically linked to the work that they're doing. So when they see issues, they're empowered to address them. Back to you.
All right, so leadership alignment. So here we have our list of what to prepare for before you approach executive leadership. So first is just be prepared to answer, why do we even need data ethics? And this is something that you can pull from like your work mapping data equity and ethics to your mission and your values when we were talking about making the case. And you can also tie in the risks of not investing this work, like Cindy just mentioned, from the regulatory perspective. We also want to be prepared to talk through what this will look like. So be prepared to like propose a timeline and think through how much time and resources do you require. Are you going to need a full-time employee? What will the deliverables look like, and how will this change how your team currently functions? Another step to take is to learn from best practices and really take the time to do your research. There are lots of really great resources out there, so be prepared to talk about how other organizations are investing in this work. And then lastly, in order to build this into your team culture, you may want to bring up the education piece of how you'll train practitioners about data ethics and equity so that they can even like be prepared to think from this lens. And something that's worked for both Cindy and I in the past is to identify an executive sponsor that kind of serves as a mentor to help us think through how to approach things and who to talk to and when. And this is kind of an easy step to ensure success so that when we go on to have larger conversations making the case for this work, you'll already have a leader who's supportive and can help you gain support from other leaders in your organization as well. Okay, so a resource that you can use to describe what the data ethics work will look like is this data ethics canvas that was developed by the Open Data Institute. So this tool helps to identify and manage ethical issues starting at the beginning of the project and then all the way throughout the end. So it encourages you to ask important questions about the purpose of your data project. It also helps you take the time to identify potential negative consequences and also in thinking through how this project should be communicated and engage with end users. So again, if the Chicago Police Department or its affiliated data scientists had kind of gone through this framework, the heatless model may have looked a lot different than it did, and Robert McDaniel's life might also just be different than how the model influenced his life.
Yeah. So now that you've gotten folks on board, the next step we're going to talk about is implementation and measurement of your data equity and AI ethics projects. And so I have found success in taking the approach I always take when I have a new idea I want to implement. So the first is developing a pilot. Here I'm going to choose a project or initiative that I want to launch in my organization. So you can refer back to those ideas that we presented at the beginning of this presentation, or if you have your own ideas, definitely go forward with those. Of course, I recommend choosing one that aligns with what's already going on in your organization. So if you don't happen to have algorithms, you're probably not going to have a lot of success if you decide that your project is going to be checking your algorithms for bias. So just make sure that they're aligned with what your organization's already doing. From there, once you figure out what that project is going to be, figure out what that pilot is going to look like. So are you going to be working with a specific team, a specific process, maybe a specific algorithm or model? How long is it going to take? What is the structure of that? How is that going to be structured? These are just some of the basic questions that you're going to run through to figure out how you're going to run this pilot. And I think one of the more important things to do here is to figure out what goals you have for the pilot and how you'll measure success. And we'll talk about examples of that on the next slide. So from there, once you have those figured out, you can go ahead and run your pilot and review what the outcome of that was. Pardon me. You're going to look at the outcomes and compare it to the goals and metrics that you set in the previous step. And so you can figure out, did you achieve what you wanted to achieve? Why or why not? Look at the strengths and weaknesses of the pilot and figure out what went well, what went poorly, so that from there you can plan the larger rollout. You can take what you learned in that pilot and figure out how you want to move forward. Do you want to do the pilot the same way, structure it the exact same way because it went off without a problem? Or, you had a lot of things that you want to tweak and maybe you run another small group pilot before you run it to the larger group. So these are just some questions that you want to ask yourself as you're going through this larger rollout plan. And before you take that step of completely rolling it out, I think it's important to reestablish the goals and success metrics that you've set in the pilot. Sometimes they're not going to be the same. You've learned things, whether or not that's, these are not the right goals or the right metrics, or they need to change for whatever reason. So those are the things to kind of keep in mind as you're going through this. I think one of the hardest things that people really struggle with is figuring out what goals and metrics make sense. So we're going to go through two examples here. So I have two of the projects that we called out on that previous slide that we're going to go through. Expand internal knowledge on data equity and ethics topics. That's what DEE stands for. And then DEE tools added into existing processes. For here, I am, when I think about the goals, I think about what am I trying to achieve? What kind of impact do I want to have with this project? And on the metric side, these are the things that are showing me that I'm making progress towards those goals. And so as I'm going through them, if you have other ideas too, I definitely want to hear them. So feel free to drop those in the chat. So we'll start with the first one, expand internal knowledge on DEE topics. With this project, I think for me, the goal, if I were to implement this, is to empower my internal team to speak up when data equity and ethics issues arise, right? If I am invested in increasing the knowledge, it's to spread awareness of how these issues can appear and ultimately take action on them. And so, how am I going to measure whether or not I'm making success towards this? I have two examples here in terms of metrics. I've been in situations where I've implemented trainings and it's been optional, and so maybe I just want to see how many of the employees that are eligible to take this training, to go through these topics and understand what's going on. So I can just see, am I reaching a good number of employees, or should I take another tactic to figure out, is this idea sticking with folks? On the other side, maybe a little bit deeper engagement is maybe I measured the number of employees that lead presentations on these topics. They're so excited, they're so informed about these things that they're excited to talk about them in other spaces. Whether that's from things like lunch and learns for their little teams, or all the way to something like this, maybe they wind up presenting at something like a Good Tech Fest. All good examples of that. On the other side, or for a different project, if I want to think about implementing DEE tools into existing processes, for me, if I were to implement this, a goal I have is I just want to make sure that data equity and ethics are present throughout the data lifecycle. So it's not just a matter of ensuring that the individual teams feel empowered to do so. It is built into steps, so it's just present throughout what people are working on. And so for here, what I might want to measure is specific tool usage. So if I implement specific tools, I want to see, are those being used, right? Perhaps I have data equity checks present that I implement during the new data collection processes. So if I decide I want to collect some new data, maybe I want to, have my team ask specific questions about how data equity would be ensured. And so I would want to see, are those checks being done? Is there evidence of that I can refer back to for every new set of data that gets collected? Maybe, that data nutrition label that Eva showed is something you want to implement in your organization. And so for every data set that gets released, I want to make sure that there's a data nutrition label that's available for that. And so I'd go back and audit and see, is that happening? How many of these data sets are being launched with that data nutrition label? So these are just some examples. There's actually more. If you have other ones that you would have ideas about, feel free to share them. And if we have time, maybe in the questions and answers, we can. If you have other projects and you're struggling with this, we can also talk through that as well. All right. So talk about implementing. Talk about sustaining it, because ultimately all the work that you put into all these previous steps are only going to have a limited impact if you don't sustain this work long term. And so in order to do so, you really need to consider how data equity and AI ethics becomes a part of your data culture. And for those of you who say, my company doesn't have a data culture, my organization doesn't have a data culture, I disagree. Everyone has a data culture because everyone's working with data, and it's just how you work with data. Some data cultures are just stronger than others, and if you want to get to a place where your data culture is stronger, you can invest in things like data equity and AI ethics to do so. We'll talk a little bit about this framework that you're seeing here. I developed this framework, and it's really, it breaks down into 3 layers: individual, department, and organization. And so as you think about how you integrate your data equity and AI ethics work into your data culture, you can figure out, you can place different initiatives into these different layers. Excuse me. So let's talk through an example. So for example, if I were to add something to the individual layer of my data culture framework, perhaps, I've done, maybe my project before was to train all existing employees in these topics. Of course, new employees will always come in, and so it's a matter of training these new employees on these topics as well, so that, they're aware of what's going on. And I'll say this, I don't think that it's just your data employees. I think this is all employees, because all employees influence data. Some are generating it, some are analyzing it, some are reading it. Everyone does something using data, so it's really important to understand how each step in that life cycle is susceptible to injustice and how they can influence equity in their work. The next level, looking at the department, consider maybe integrating some of the tools that we've talked about and checks into the department level processes, because that helps reinforce learning. For example, we'll take that data collection process example I talked about before. Some of the questions that you can build into that process might be thinking about how are we making sure that information is being protected? How are they making sure that they're checking for inclusivity in the provided options of data collection? How are they ensuring a thorough sampling so data sets are not biased? These are some of the questions that I might want my team to ask as they're going through new data collection processes. And that's just a part of that process, right? In addition to establishing what metric or what data am I collecting, how are we ensuring some of these things, right? And lastly, on the organization level, maybe I want to include data equity and ethics metrics regularly, so that they're reported at the company level. Of course, if you've already done the previous step through implementation of measuring the impact that your DEE projects are having, you can pull those up and pull them into here, so that you can share that information and show a dedication to data equity and AI ethics, and help people understand the influence they have to do good. So that's all of it. We hope this slide is a lot less scary now than it was at the beginning of the presentation. You have an idea of where to get started and how to have an impact with this really important topic.
All right, so to wrap up, prioritizing better practices is key, and we have this quote on the screen here from the Feminist Data Manifesto. Data is a thing, a process, and a relationship we make and put to use. We can make it and use it differently. So we just wanted to close out with these words of encouragement. Just starting to think about data ethics and AI equity has an impact, and just building it into your own day-to-day is a really great place to start. And it'll eventually influence your data culture and your data projects. So hopefully the steps that we've talked about today can help you see where you can get started, and this is a little bit less daunting. All right, so we really hope you learned a lot today. A lot of the materials that we talked through today and the resources that we shared also come up in our workshops, Leading Equitable Data Practices. And our goal here at LA Tech for Good is to train people to think about data in its respective context, instead of just focusing on technical foundations. So we really like to encourage folks to think from the lens of social justice and design justice, as you use data as a tool to further equity in the missions of your organizations. So you got a glimpse of this today, but our curriculum is centered on practical, hands-on work. You're encouraged to bring your own project and apply these resources to it as you discuss. and it's very conversational and community-based. And then the last thing I'll mention is that we are cross-sector and industry agnostic, so we can also tailor our workshops to your interests, whether you're interested in enrolling as an individual for our public workshops, or if you'd be interested in getting a larger group at your organization to do a corporate workshop with us.
And once you go through the amazing workshop at LA Tech for Good, as I mentioned before, I'm a consultant. And so if you need implementation support of taking those concepts and bringing them into your organization, I hope you'll consider engaging with me. I specialize in data culture as a fractional BI leader and as a data product manager. And so if you're interested in engaging in that level and a deeper level, definitely check it out. I also have an ongoing blog series on data culture. So if that concept was interesting to you, feel free to check out my website. It's on there.
All right, so thank you. Stay in touch. You see here on the screen links to our data workshop. We also have a list of data equity resources, like the ones that we talked about today that pull from other organizations. I'm happy to meet for a virtual coffee, and that's my email. And please reach out either to me or to the organization on LinkedIn if you're interested in enrolling in a workshop or a custom workshop for your organization.
Awesome. And questions. I actually saw that there was one question in the chat. Eva, I'll throw this to you as our data scientist. Can you discuss implementation strategies for introducing algorithmic bias corrections other than adjusting training data?
Yeah, so I think fairness evaluations are a really great place to start with. That is just even to identify like where the bias is stemming from. From there, I'm sure I can link you to some resources afterwards on how to approach that. No names are coming to mind, but I know there are lots of research groups at universities that are kind of devoted to helping you identify and adjust any algorithmic bias that you're seeing.
Maybe if you leave a way for us to contact you, we can follow up with specifics. Any other questions? Give us a second here. Awesome. Tell us what you're working on. Sure. Like I mentioned, I'm working on this blog series. I just released the second one in the blog series, talking about the things to think about at the organizational layer of your data culture and the components that make up a strong data culture at the organization layer. I'm going to be releasing at least one for the department and individual as well. I'm also working with I'm looking at a slightly different audience base than you might think for some work on the data consulting side, working with small businesses and nonprofits on how they can make an impact and answer some of their questions with data. Yeah.
Oh, everything to add.
Awesome. Cool. Well, we're on the internet. You can find us online. If you have questions you want to ask us separately, or if you want to follow up with LA Tech for Good, I know Karen has been dropping that information in the chat. We really appreciate you attending today. And that's it. Have a great day.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.